don't worry too much under conditions of perfect rationality, because it's an ideal situation. We have free access to as much information as we want, and we know the type of information that we need or want, right? So it's all fairly straightforward. It's not one that causes me a headache. Okay, perfect rationality is a good situation to be in. Okay, and our major concern under conditions of perfect rationality, so when we're operating under those conditions and making decisions or debating options, our major concern or our major criterion, if you will, is maximizing our economic value. Okay? So that's why we say kind of your prototypical person or kind of the most generic type of person who's operating under these conditions is a person who we call the economic person. And what we think of them or how we characterize them is they're only concerned with maximizing their economic value, right? They want to get the most bang for their buck. That's it, right? Because everything else has been figured out, right? Information is available to them at no cost. They know what information they want. They know the consequences. They know the rewards of a certain decision. Okay? So all that matters to them is the economic value they're going to reap from this decision or this activity that they're engaging in. Okay? So the economic person, the key criterion for them when they're making a decision is economic gain or economic value that they're getting. Okay? Now on the other hand, we have conditions of bounded rationality. And that's where it's, as you might expect, it's quite the opposite. Things are not as straightforward. Things are not as predictable. You're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. You're dealing with a lot of ambiguity in that environment. Okay? So it's not very ideal because there's a lot of stress that comes with that. You're trying to figure out a certain problem that you may not have had previous experience with, and you don't know what you're going into. You don't know what information perhaps you need. Okay? You're very much likely to commit so many errors and biases in the process. You may have the wrong understanding of the problem to start with because it's just very ambiguous and very tough to deal with. Perhaps it's a very complex problem. Okay? And you're constricted by time, you're constricted by other resources. Like perhaps you don't have access to too much information. Okay? Perhaps it's a new problem that you've never dealt with before. It's a new phenomenon in organizations. Okay? And all of a sudden you're left dealing with it, right? So there's likely limited information about how to go about dealing with it from before. Okay? So I don't know, perhaps take artificial intelligence, right? It's the buzzword of the season. We're all trying to figure out artificial intelligence and how it works in organizations and what we could do with it in organizations. That's probably not a well-structured problem, right? There's a lot of ambiguity. We're still not sure about the ethical dilemmas that come with it. We're not sure, is it good for employees? Is it bad for employees? Is it going to eradicate jobs? Is it not, right? So that's something that is new for us, relatively new for us in industry, right? We're dealing with a new phenomenon, something that we don't know much about, okay? So there's probably going to be a lot of trial and error. There's going to be a lot of faultiness. There's going to be a lot of biases committed, a lot of mistakes and errors committed in the process of implementing AI or integrating artificial intelligence in our organizations. Okay? Now, given what we've talked about when it comes to perfect versus bounded rationality, in general, like if you take life, day-to-day life, or day-to-day life in organizations, what conditions would you say we're operating within or under? Kind of as the human beings of today, do you think we're operating under conditions of perfect rationality, or are we more so under conditions of bounded rationality nowadays? Noah?
I think it depends, just because perfect rationality, like, we have so much information available to us online.
Sure.
And all that stuff, but in reality, we're quite naive as to what is out there, so in that case, I would say bounded, but
Okay.
I would say half and half.
Okay. Lavina?
I agree. I believe it's a combination of both.
Okay.
I think that it kind of changes as you grow up. I think it has a lot of factors.
And you mean kind of as we get experience and perspective in life? Okay.
As you grow, you learn more different things. You kind of, in certain situations, they might seem perfect for one, whereas it's bounded for another.
Okay.
So I think it's very dependent. And it changes.
Okay. Other thoughts? Are we all in agreement with Lavina and Noah's understanding?
And sure, it depends, but it also depends if you are counting your everyday life, like you wake up, you wear this, this is how you cook, this is what you eat, or if you're looking for more things doing with your job, and that again depends on your job. If you're like an innovator, inventor, you're in a bounded area, but if your job is like, for example, as a lower level accountant, your
Sure.
job is determined for you, so it's not a lot of
Okay.
background.
Okay. Noah, some more thoughts?
I also think it depends on where you're from. So like third
Culture.
world,
Okay.
third world country versus first world country.
Okay. Tell us more.
I would say like in a first world country it was more perfect rather than bounded, just because
Okay.
if you have the technology
Okay.
compared to maybe when in a third world country where they don't have as much technology and there's not
Okay.
enough, there's not a lot of information at their
Okay.
available to them.
Okay, interesting. So kind of tying it to Zara's point, like for example, things like breakfast, for example, let's say you're a country going through war, let's say, there's more uncertainty, there's more needs, that, right? You're tying it even, like if you think about our motivation lecture from last week, right? There are more needs that are potentially unmet, so there's maybe some uncertainty being introduced there. Okay, yeah, good point. Yeah, you guys did it justice kind of in answering that. You're doing the contingency approach that we studied earlier on in the semester, quite some justice there. In that, yeah, I would say I would agree with you in that it is a bit of a spectrum, right? Certain decisions or certain tasks that we're dealing with might be more perfect than others, right? Especially if it's something that has become programmed over time. So something like, yeah, the breakfast that you're having every morning, I would say that's probably something that has, become programmed for yourself over time. So it's quite, not uncertain anymore. Whereas, yeah, going into your job as like someone who's in advertising or something very creative, you're probably dealing with new stuff every day. So there's more uncertainty with that, let's say. We could think of it that way. Yeah, and with certain jobs, sometimes you kind of program them over time or you figure out the process over time. So it's less an uncertainty, right? And that's why we always want to introduce challenging work, new work for people, right? We want them to always be dealing with something that is going to grow their skill set. Okay, so yeah, perfect points there. So always think about it in terms of a spectrum, right? It's not kind of always one or the other. We could get close to kind of knowing more about certain things, right? But there will always be some level of uncertainty in the environment, I would say. So remain conscious or cognizant of that. Now, let me actually go back to this slide. Now, as we started a few slides ago, we're going to be discussing mostly in this lecture the rational decision-making process. And my advice to you for when you're studying this chapter or this lecture, essentially this is your blueprint for it. Okay? We're going to be going in the next few slides, or in the remaining slides, we're going to be going through every step of the rational decision-making process. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be comparing how it goes when you're operating under conditions of perfect rationality and how it goes when you're operating under conditions of bounded rationality. Okay? And that's essentially all we're going to be doing. We're going to be taking each step of that process and we're going to be picturing what it's like to do it, okay, under the two conditions. We're going to be comparing and contrasting. Okay? We're going to be pinpointing the faults and the errors that are committed, okay, under conditions of bounded rationality at each step of the process. Okay? So that is my advice to you in how to kind of go about understanding this chapter or this lecture better, or your blueprint for it should. Okay? And we're going to be starting with that first step of identifying the problem. Okay? So that's when you've encountered a problem in the organization, or in your department, or something that you're doing in your tasks. And now we're starting to approach it. We're starting to try to gain some level of understanding surrounding what it is that we're dealing with. Okay? And that's why a key feature of what's happening in the stage of problem identification is framing. Okay? And we talked about framing earlier on in the semester when it came to the perception lecture, the lecture on the perceptual process. And a key mechanism that is operating here, or a key process that is going on at this stage, in the stage of identifying the problem, okay, is gaining a better understanding as to what it is that we're dealing with, and gaining some perspective surrounding the task or the issue that is at hand. Okay? So we're trying to frame it. We're trying to understand what it is that is being given to us, or what it is that we're dealing with, right? And we talked quite a bit so far about how human beings perceive things differently. They frame things differently based on their history, based on their emotions, based on their moods. So the framing process or the framing mechanism could introduce some errors or some faultiness there. Okay? And framing is quite important, especially when people differ in how they frame certain things. Okay? So if I'm working in accounting or in finance, and there's a $10,000 expenditure to be made, okay? One person may view it as an investment, as it's a $10,000 investment right now, but it's going to get us more money later on. 5 years down the road, it's going to actually be quite a successful investment, and it's going to generate even more profit for us. Or somebody who, let's say, is more conservative with money might say, it's still a negative balance, like it's a cost, it's not something that could potentially lead to positive gains, right? So depending on how you frame this $10,000 expenditure, you may either go for it or not go for it in the organization, okay? And that's just one minor example of how we see framing come about in our decisions, or how it actually manifests and generates some sort of tangible outcome at the end, okay? Now, when it comes to conditions of perfect rationality, so let's say somebody is operating under conditions of perfect rationality, okay, some key things that we need to remember is that they have access to all information at no cost, they know what they want, and they know how they're going to use this information, they know the level of risk with it, they know the uncertainties that come with it, okay? So under conditions of perfect rationality, we're not usually concerned about how they're going to frame the problem, because all the information is available to them. They have quite a bit to work with. So their framing of the problem is likely to be more accurate or close to accurate. Okay? So we're not concerned with any faultiness there. We're not concerned with any errors coming out of this framing of the problem under conditions of perfect rationality. Okay? No.
So would perfectly rational, would that be considered like an investment for them because they know what the consequences are and everything compared to the cost?
No, not necessarily. No, not necessarily. I wouldn't take it that way, right? It could apply across various situations. They don't have to take it or consider it as an investment, but it's just their framing of it is more accurate. So it may actually, that investment may actually be, like going back to that $10,000 expenditure example, right? It may actually not be profitable, but someone who's operating under conditions of perfect rationality would be able to predict that it's not going to be profitable way earlier on, right? So they have the information that they need to actually make a more accurate decision there. Okay? So they will know early on whether it's going to be a good investment or a bad one, essentially, if you want. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, like if you had like a perfect, right, to use this as a comparison to first rationality. Like say I'm a CEO.
Okay.
I'm able to know everything like what my company is doing and understand like that this won't affect it, whereas compared to if I'm just one of the employees and the CEO tells me to do something, I only know like the one thing that he's telling me. So like I kind of have like a biased perspective on that.
I mean, one thing that I'll ask you to kind of think about though, do CEOs necessarily, just because they're at the very top and they're at the helm, do they have all the information about everything that's going on in the organization?
No.
Right? And we're going to be seeing this when it comes to solution implementation. We're going to be seeing it as the principal agent problem. So think to your economics classes, right?
Okay, so what if it was like I'm the CEO and an employee comes to me with a situation.
Okay.
I only know the perspective of that.
That one employee.
But if I'm the one that's going through the problem, then I'm able to, since I'm the one that's also dealing with the issue.
Since you have a personal stake in it?
Yeah, I'm able to kind of know at least my perspective and like it's happening since the problem is affecting me directly.
Okay, so you have more stake in it, more experience in dealing with it, right? So you have more historical information or background information on it. I would say you're closer, perhaps, to being in a more perfect condition, more perfect rationality type of condition. But again, not where it comes. We need to ask more questions. I would say certainly like what the problem is specifically, assessing the different level of uncertainty and risk with it, right? Because just because you've dealt with something in the past doesn't mean it's going to be the same way across the board, right? The market is not the same right now as it was when that decision you made at a previous point, right? Like there are different factors in the environment that could also affect that. You might be better off than somebody else who's never dealt with it, but right, keep in mind that there's some level of uncertainty always in the environment. Right? And that's why we said kind of, it's always a spectrum, and it could change, right? At certain points in a certain project, you may have everything you thought you needed, and it's going well. But then as you progress through it, you may uncover things that you've never dealt with before, and it's all very new and ambiguous to you. Okay? So keep that in mind. Okay? Now, going back to framing as a key mechanism or as a key aspect of the problem identification stage, so we've talked about how for the perfectly rational decision maker, somebody who's operating under conditions of perfect rationality, things are going to go smoothly, things are going to be straightforward. Now, when it comes to somebody who's operating under conditions of bounded rationality, and all of a sudden they're encountering this problem that they're trying to get a better understanding of, there we start kind of worrying about them. Okay? So some biases or some errors or some faults that we see being committed in that stage, we see the mechanism of perceptual defense, right? We've talked about that in the lecture on perception. Okay? So I'm only going to see the things that benefit me, the positive things, but I'm going to keep out negative things, things that could threaten me. Okay? So you may actually try to brush away the problematic aspects of this issue, and you're only going to see it as something that is very straightforward to deal with. So you may see perceptual defense being committed there. Okay? Some people may kind of get fixated. They might think that the problem is only a marketing problem, and it's not something that perhaps is organization-wide. Okay? Some people focus on treating the symptoms, okay? And they don't focus on figuring out the root cause of the problem. So you see that error being committed quite a bit. Okay? Or some people might focus on the solution, kind of on just figuring out on something that could be implemented, but again, not really paying attention to the root cause of the problem. Okay, so we notice that sick day usage is going up in our organization. People are reporting greater levels of absence. So somebody might be inclined to say, somebody who has not done their research very well or has done their due diligence in that respect, might say, well, maybe we're giving them too much sick days. Maybe we need to cut sick days. That's not the root cause of the problem. People are reporting greater levels of absence or taking more sick days because perhaps the work environment is quite daunting and they are needing to kind of recuperate quite a bit. Okay? And that is actually a conversation I overheard between two Air Canada employees one day on my way back from the airport, where one employee was telling a newer member of the workforce, she was like, yeah, we actually used to have that many sick days, but then they cut us back because they noticed a lot of people were maxing all their sick days. So Air Canada's approach was that they thought, employees are kind of taking it a bit overboard and they're abusing it. So they were actually criticizing kind of that approach that the organization took.
Could it just be like flu season or something?
It could, right? And obviously, like you're working as a flight attendant or you're working long hours, right? The graveyard shift in the airport. Like, obviously, that is the one kind of environment where you're likely to use a lot of sick days, I would say. So that's, where you want to focus on figuring out or teasing out the root cause of the problem. So why are we seeing a lot of sick days being reported by our employees? Okay? It's not because they're necessarily always trying to abuse it, right? And we don't want to cut it off. There's probably some underlying cause.
If you wanted to change that and maybe reduce the amount of sick days that employees take, but it's an external factor that you may not have any control over.
Something that goes through everybody, right?
Yeah,
And it could be that, right? Sometimes it could be that. So I don't know, you may do some little things where like, we have sanitizers, right? Because they're dealing face-to-face with people all the time. You may be able to kind of intervene up to a certain extent, but there are always external factors, right? For sure. We're thinking more so kind of, though, some things they could do is maybe we need to revisit our scheduling of employees, how we schedule them, how we give them rests, right? Enough sufficient rests between shifts, perhaps something along those lines. Okay. Questions about the problem identification stage or the framing mechanism specifically? Okay. Now, we've approached our problem, we've identified it, we've framed it, or we've kind of built some sort of solid perspective on what it is that we're dealing with. Now we're starting to figure out what information we need to actually delve into it and figure out what it is that we're dealing with and how we're going to be solving it. Okay? So a key feature or key mechanism right now that we're dealing with is that of the information search. Okay? And again, somebody who's operating under conditions of perfect rationality, remember, information is quite generous or quite available to them at no cost. Okay, they know what pieces of information they need and they know how they're going to use it. Right, so they've already limited the uncertainty of the situation quite a bit by knowing that. Okay, they know where to go about getting this information, where they could access it from. Okay, so they're dealing with something that's a bit straightforward to them. Okay, so their information search mechanism or process is going to go in a smooth manner. It's going to be quite straightforward under conditions of perfect Whereas under conditions of bounded rationality, okay, where information might be limited, or perhaps you're dealing with a lot of information, and you just don't know how to even start sifting through it, right? And you don't know what's relevant and what's irrelevant, right? There are a lot of cognitive biases or a lot of errors and faults that could be committed at this stage, in the stage of the information search. Okay? So cognitive biases really give us an idea as to how we treat that information when we're trying to come up with a certain solution. Okay? And oftentimes what we worry about is that people are seeking or prioritizing efficiency. Okay? So they're going to expedite the process, right? So when we think about stereotyping, for example, we talked about stereotyping a few weeks ago, right? So you're making an efficient decision or an efficient judgment. Okay? You're getting through that process much faster, but it may not be accurate. Okay? And that's because there's a lot of uncertainty in that environment. So you're making maybe an emotional judgment there. Okay? You're relying on something that is not objective, something that is not founded in any evidence, perhaps. Okay? But you're jumping to a conclusion just so you can kind of be efficient and come to a decision or finalize that process. Okay? But we do worry about the accuracy of the decision or the outcomes quite a bit there. So cognitive biases are really things that are quite manifest in the process of decision making, and we do need to worry about them. And we're going to be kind of digging deeper and seeing what types of cognitive biases come about at different stages. We already started alluding to this a bit, but under conditions of bounded rationality, again, we could be dealing with a ton of information, or we could be dealing with information that is quite limited. Okay? So maybe, again, it's a new phenomenon. It's something that I've never dealt with before, okay? And I don't even know where to get started or who's done research on it or if there is research on it to start with. So you could be dealing with a situation where there's very limited information or too little information, okay? And a major bias that we see being committed there, or we see people kind of falling for, is that confirmation bias, okay? And confirmation biases are essentially kind of very prevalent when you have very little information, okay? So you start kind of with one idea or with one little piece of information, and you only consider pieces of information that are similar or that support that, okay? Because you really don't have anything else to work with. So you're quite under pressure there. So all you know is this one piece of information, and that's painting your perspective, or that's the only thing you're going off of, okay? And you're just kind of adding more information that falls in line with it. Okay? So you're being quite choosy here. You're being quite selective in what information you're letting into your system, and you're analyzing and you're processing. Okay? And that's because you just don't know where else to go to get information, or that information is just not available. So you're left dealing with that. Okay? And sometimes we want to be careful about that. Okay? Because you don't want to be making that bias. You want to be making sure that you're making as comprehensive a decision as possible. You want to be taking in as many perspectives as possible. If I am deciding on an HR initiative just on the basis of one OB and HR researcher who has a certain perspective or a certain belief system or a certain way of doing research, okay? If I only take that researcher's work and base my initiatives off of that researcher, I'm introducing a bias because that's only one perspective out of many. Okay? So you want to make sure that you're diversifying, you're being comprehensive in your information search. It is tough at times, but you want to make sure you're doing your due diligence to the best of your abilities there. On the other hand of it, when we could be dealing with cases of too much information, okay, so we're dealing with information overload here, okay, and while you may be tempted to think or inclined to think that that's great, we have a lot to work with, okay, one thing that could hamper us is again that volume in itself, even though it may appear to be something that's positive, but how we treat copious amounts of information and huge volumes of information, that could also be detrimental sometimes, or it could kind of trip us up in a sense. Okay? We are often inclined to use all the information that we find, all the information that is given to us. We have that knack, or we have that tendency to think that it's all important. But sometimes there are certain pieces of information that may not be relevant to your problem. You may not actually be able to use them, or they may not help you at all in the decision-making process. So you want to make sure you have a good understanding surrounding what it is that you need, okay? Because that's going to inform what type of information you'll actually extract and utilize, okay? People also have that tendency when they pay for information, okay? So think about an organization hiring a marketing research firm to collect market data for them. That's where we also see kind of that bias come about. When you pay for information, okay, and they deliver to you like this whole huge data set of information, they also kind of have that tendency to use up all that information, even though sometimes some bits and pieces of it may not be relevant to the key decision that you're trying to make at a certain point. Okay, so that's another situation where we see information overload. So some biases come about in respect to. Okay, questions about too much or too little information and the biases that we see come about within that stage. Okay. Now, we've identified our problem, we started our information search, now we're starting to figure out what are the potential avenues that we can be taking. Okay, we're at the stage of developing alternatives, and how we're going to be assessing those alternatives. So developing the criteria that we're going to be enforcing. Okay, so we're at that stage now. Okay, now, here's where I'll ask you to remember the economic person that we talked about under conditions of perfect rationality. Okay, so what was the key criterion of the economic person? Somebody who's operating under conditions of perfect rationality. What are they looking after? What is the only thing they're concerned with or that they're after? Economic gain or value. Okay, so when it comes to alternative development and evaluation, the criteria that you're enforcing, okay, the perfectly rational decision maker, or somebody who's operating under conditions of perfect rationality, all they're concerned with is, again, maximization of value. Okay? That's what they're concerned with. Okay? So they're obviously going to suggest and potentially go for the option, or most likely go for the option that is going to maximize their economic gain. Okay? Whereas when it comes to somebody who's operating under conditions of bounded rationality, again, it's not as clear-cut. Okay? So they're going to come up with certain alternatives, right? A few alternatives. And they're going to try to figure out some criteria to enforce or to consider when they're assessing these alternatives, right? A major bias or a major error that we see people commit when it comes to deciding on an alternative under conditions of bounded rationality is that of satisficing, okay? In that, here what is happening is you have somebody who's operating under conditions of uncertainty and ambiguity. There's a lot that they don't know. There's a lot at stake. There's a lot of risk involved in this situation. Okay? And all of a sudden, they're having to figure out which alternative they're going to choose or which criteria they're going to enforce and how to go about assessing these alternatives against those criteria. Okay? So this person is already dealing with quite a bit of unknown to start with. Okay? Now, because we just want to get done with this problem, right? I'm working 9 to 5. I'm tired of making decisions. I'm going through decision-making fatigue in this organization. I just want to get it over with. What we tend to do is we tend to satisfice. We commit this thing of satisficing, okay? And satisficing, essentially, what it boils down to is we're just going to accept the bare minimum. We're going to go for the decision that will guarantee us the bare minimum level of acceptability, okay? So I'm just going to do whatever it takes to get me out of the office basically today by 5 p.m. so that I don't have to keep dealing with this decision or this issue that is at hand. Okay? So a lot of times that's what we drift towards. Okay? We're just going to commit the bare minimum. We're going to do the bare minimum just to get us done with this problem, and then it'll resolve itself. Whatever happens, happens. Okay? So that is a key bias or a key error that we see human beings or employees commit in organizations. Questions about satisficing? Okay. Now, we're at the solution implementation stage, so we've considered different alternatives. We've decided on the criteria we're going to enforce towards assessing those alternatives. Okay? And we've selected one, right? Now we're going to be implementing it. Okay? So going back to your point, Diego, surrounding kind of like you might have a CEO who's at the very top, and yeah, some people might expect that CEO to know everything. Okay? But that's not the case in organizations. Okay? A CEO is usually dealing with very high-level strategic decisions. Okay? But you might be dealing with more simple day-to-day stuff that is at a much more minute level that the CEO, would not want to be bothered with, right? That's why we have middle managers to deal with those day-to-day stuff, right? But that's where, we could run into that problem, the principal agent problem, okay? In that you have somebody at the helm, somebody at the top who's the principal, okay? But you have other people kind of doing that implementation of the solution, Okay? So yes, you may have been strategically involved with selecting the solution or the alternative that is the best alternative possible. But oftentimes what happens is that that is then diffused onto others, people at the lower levels, to implement that. Okay? And middle managers are supposedly there to monitor the process and make sure that the day-to-day activities that go towards implementing that are done correctly or up to a certain standard. Okay? But it is something that we want to keep in mind, and that there could be some faultiness at the solution implementation stage because the people who decided on it, the people who actually approved this strategic decision, let's say, they're not the people who are actually involved in the day-to-day stuff that go towards implementing it. Okay? So that's why, yeah, you may think that, this is how this strategy is going to work and this is how it's going to be implemented, and that's all great on paper, right? But the way it actually comes to be at the very end may be different. Okay? And that's where we see that principal agent issue or problem come about. Okay? And that, yes, we expect things to go a certain way, but the people who are doing the work for you may not do it as you expected, may not be motivated to do it as you expected or up to the standard that you expected it to be. Okay? Or, I don't know, they just don't want to do it, right? Counterproductive work behaviors, process losses. Okay? So lots of things could be going there in that solution implementation stage that could not help you realize the best outcome possible or the outcome that you imagine to come about. Okay? Does that clear it up?
Oh,
yeah? Other questions about solution implementation or some things that we see come about at the solution implementation stage? Any thoughts on it? Keep going, Jeremy.
Is the best way to minimize the...
Yeah, what are your thoughts on the best way to kind of deal with that principal agent issue? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm assuming that you just have to make sure you polish the steps beforehand in order to make sure...
Sure, yeah, that's always one, right? Across the board, yeah.
This is really where the action is made. Like, everything else is just planning, and then the action is made, and I'm sure the rest of it
Yeah.
is kind of like...
Yeah, so one key thing that we always want to push for or advocate is you're investing as much time as possible in your initial planning stages, identifying the problem, right? Because sometimes people kind of only identify maybe a symptom or a certain aspect of the problem, but not really the root cause. So we want to make sure that that is being done up to standard. So that is one I would say. Daniela, go ahead and then we'll keep going.
I think a big problem with solutions is that a lot of the time there's no follow-up.
Sure.
So, like, all this time is put into developing the solution, but then people don't take the time to assess whether or not it actually works.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
everyone's there.
Right? Yeah, and then that goes back to that point surrounding feedback that we talked about last week, right? And that feedback is critical to generating and mobilizing more motivation out of employees. So you're hitting on that feedback component there quite in a good way. Diego?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also, like, I haven't seen anything yet about, like, a step to communicate this information.
Right.
Like, diffuse it properly and implement it work.
Yeah, and that's another one, right? When it comes to the communication and the channels that you are using, right? How do you diffuse that information? How do you make sure that, yes, we decided on that at a strategic higher up level, but how do you make sure that it's trickled down in an accurate manner, right? So that's where kind of some goal setting could be done, some management by objectives, right, is done to help middle managers really diffuse that high-level strategic decision all the way to the bottom, right? Some things that further help that process is when you make sure that the assessment criteria are, please phones off. So the way you're judging the work, the accountability is established, the consequences are established, the rewards are established. So you want to make sure there's a lot of clarity surrounding that, right? Expectations, right, from your employees surrounding that. We've talked a lot about role clarity and making sure that they're well informed as to what is expected of them, right? So these are things that we could see kind of going towards helping that. Okay, we talked quite a bit about kind of cross-functional teams, right? So you're not just kind of like siloing your approach, but you're making sure that multiple people from different specialties or teams are involved in this, right? You could say that that is helpful in pointing out errors, right? Or pointing out biases, so we could minimize and cancel each other's biases early on before the solution is fully implemented. Okay?
I think also just like diffusing information and like because you make the decision, but also like diffusing why you're making that decision because that's how
Okay.
the middle
Yeah.
management can
So making sure you communicate the rationale.
Yeah.
Okay, absolutely, right? So any background information as to, or the procedures through which we figured out that this is the best course of action.
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay. Any other thoughts on solution implementation or what we just discussed? Okay, perfect. Now, we've implemented our solution, and now we're at the stage of evaluating how it went about or how it was done. Did it succeed? Did it not succeed? Usually what we see is happening there under conditions of perfect rationality. Whether the solution was successful or not successful, a perfectly rational decision maker is able to conduct objective assessments of what went on and what came about, what outcomes came about. But they're also very good at accepting kind of failure or success. So they're not going to kind of push back or be reactive if the decision failed. Okay, they're going to treat it in the most objective manner possible. Okay, they're going to try to learn from it, perhaps. Okay, the likelihood even of failure could be quite low, you could argue, under such conditions because it's conditions of perfect rationality. So they know quite a bit about what to expect and what they could get out of it. Okay, so things are definitely more straightforward as we've seen across different stages there. But when it comes to conditions of bounded rationality, okay, so when somebody's operating under conditions of bounded rationality, that's where, again, we see some uncertainty and some faultiness come about. So some key biases or some key things or activities that we see people committing at the solution evaluation stage, we tend to see people justify their actions, right? Especially if they failed, right? Because you're so convinced by what you proposed. You're so convinced by the solution that you've selected. You've been championing it in the organization and you thought it was definitely going to save the organization. But all of a sudden, let's say it failed. It didn't actually do what it was supposed to do. Okay? As human beings, again, if you remember perceptual defense, you remember how we don't like to have our ego kind of pushed down, right? We don't like these things. So we have that tendency to try to justify what we did. We always kind of look back and say, well, this is why we did it. This happened because of this, right? So you're coming up with all these excuses and alibis for what happened, okay? And you could argue that that's quite a bit reactive, right? Because you're not necessarily always learning from it. You're only dwelling on the past and on the mechanisms that went on or the rationales that, helped you make that decision a bit earlier on. But you're not really forward-looking. You're not really kind of figuring out how to move forward with what happened and how to learn from it, okay? So you want to be a bit cognizant of that. We see that happening quite a bit, or we see kind of quite a bit of errors being committed when it comes to sunk costs, right? If you remember from your Principles of Microeconomics class, sunk cost is a cost that has already been committed, okay? It's something that we've already incurred, okay? So we've lost the money, right? I decided on something, I made a purchase, the money has already been lost, okay? So when we're making, let's say, you're not convinced anymore with what you spent money on or with how you spent that money, you shouldn't consider that money at a later point in the decision-making process because it's already lost. You could not recuperate that money, okay? It's already been taken out of your account. That's it. But what people often do is they always keep that sunk cost in their mind, okay? And that's faulty. That's an error there, okay? Because those resources are gone. We can't actually recuperate them anymore, okay? So you can't always be thinking of them, and you can't always be bringing them back into your decision-making process in the future. You can't always be kind of like justifying on that basis, okay? So we often see that error being committed in how we treat sunk costs. Another bias or another fault or error that we commit is the hindsight bias, okay? And that's where you see people kind of saying things like, oh, well, I knew it all along, or in hindsight, I said this, and this is why it worked, right? Sometimes things happen for different reasons, or certain outcomes pan out for different reasons. But again, we tend to kind of give ourselves credit for the successes of things, and then when it comes to failures, right, we kind of keep those away from us, okay? So if something panned out as we expected it to pan out, okay, we'll say that this is all due to me. The success, I take credit for it. It's great, okay? I'm the one who proposed it to start with, right? So in hindsight, you should thank me because I'm the one who actually advocated for it. But then if it's a failure, if it's something that didn't pan out as you expected it to pan out, that's where you're going to get maybe a bit reactive. That's where you're going to say, oh, it wasn't me. In hindsight, it was everybody else who supported this. I wasn't pushing for this decision to start with. Okay? So you see those dynamics go on in such situations. Another thing that we see happen, and it's quite a major mechanism or quite a major activity or action that we tend to commit in organizations, is that of escalation of commitment. Okay? And escalation of commitment refers to kind of the idea or the action or the activity of investing more resources in a failing course of action because you're thinking that that's just going to save it or that's going to help you salvage that failing solution or failing outcome. Okay? So we commit that bias, or we have a tendency to kind of be a bit naive, if you will, to say kind of, yeah, if I put more money into it or if I invest more time into it, I could salvage it. I could save this failing project. Whereas actually, this project might be failing because from the start, it was a bad idea. From the start, we identified the problem incorrectly. From the start, we did not do our due diligence in the information search. So there might be some root causes to the problem that you kind of committed errors with, and we're seeing them come to be at the solution implementation stage, okay? And now we've implemented it and now we're evaluating it. But you think you could redeem yourself in a sense, or you think that you could salvage this failing project, okay? You could imagine that we tend to see this done quite a bit with maybe executive CEOs or people at the higher level, right? Or if maybe you've been a champion of that strategy or that decision, right? So you've gotten a lot of visibility, right? Because you're the champion behind, you're the person who's championing that decision, right? And imagine all of a sudden it's failing, okay? Everybody knows that you were the one who championed it. So a major reason for why escalation of commitment happens, especially when you've been kind of a major person in this project, or you're the CEO, you're an executive who's been kind of funding it, you want to save face, okay? Because you're essentially what you're feeling on the inside is a bit of shame, and you don't want your ego to be brought down, right? So you think, or you're inclined to think that if you just add a bit more money to it or a few more resources to it, you're going to salvage it. And that's going to help you save face. So a major predictor or a major reason for why we escalate commitment is because we want to make sure that we always look good, right? So I'm the CEO, I'm the savior of this organization. I'm supposed to be making great decisions for my employees and for the organization. And this one happened to fail, okay? You're very much so inclined to kind of save face by saying, like, we're going to wrap this around, right? We're going to salvage it. All we need is a few more a bit more money to go into it, and we could salvage it, right? So that's a major thing that drives that type of behavior. When sometimes the project could have been failing from the start, and there was really no need to add more money to it or more resources, because it's just going into more failure.
That's kind of like the God complex.
Okay, is it God it's called?
I guess so.
I know there's an, okay, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is it called a God?
I've heard that before.
Okay. Yeah, so you think kind of like you're the savior perhaps, and you're the one who's kind of is in charge of always delivering the decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps I could see that there.
Yeah, it's a good example of this, the wall.
You want to bring in politics into this. What are your thoughts? I'll ask you to talk about that.
Well, I mean, like it seems like this project's kind of already like failing, and then he's trying to implement more money, and every single time he's talked about it, he seems to be increasing his budget and justifying it because it's going well or whatever, right?
Okay.
So I don't know.
Okay. What do you think, Noah? About?
I think he's completely right. Like that's totally what's happening right now.
You think that's a depiction of okay?
Taking money from other parts, like other sections that need money just to go towards this.
Okay.
And then he says we need you American people to help me build this
Okay.
wall. So like there was a GoFundMe page for this wall, and they had to like return all the money back.
Okay.
And like it's just
Okay. And you're arguing that the evidence is against it?
well, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
it's just, it's not
There's no
feasible. It's way too expensive. It causes division between countries.
Okay. Okay. Well, there you go. We're already applying the rational decision-making process and the different biases and faults that come with it. Okay. Yeah, that's a good application of it. I'll give you that. Any other thoughts on escalation of commitment? Yeah, Danielle.
Have you guys heard of the play pumps?
The play pumps? Okay, tell us more.
No one has heard of those.
Has anyone heard about the play pumps?
Oh, you guys should watch that documentary.
It's a documentary. Okay.
Yeah.
Give us a synopsis, brief
Yeah,
synopsis
basically
about it.
this like organization in the States has this big grandiose idea to put these, it's like a little play structure thing.
Okay.
You know, the ones that you spin around, the kids jump on it, whatever.
Yeah.
So they created a way for that to basically run the water system
Oh, okay.
in like different towns. But basically it caused like a lot more harm than good, and they ended up sending towns that were doing just fine for water production.
And sorry,
like
the harm,
a drought.
like physical harm, like to the kids, or
Like, it was supposed to be like a fun thing,
yeah.
but these like play structures ended up not being very fun to play on, or
Okay.
they put them in areas where there were no children, so it ended up being like women who were using them,
Oh,
and
okay.
it was like obviously very
Yeah.
controversial.
Okay.
Or they implemented them in towns that physically they didn't work,
need them. Okay.
or they didn't need them,
Okay.
like their system was already fine. So they just like totally exploited all these
Yeah.
people, came in with this solution to a problem that they didn't even accurately identify.
Right. Yeah. Or it didn't exist in certain
Yeah.
parts, right? Okay.
And it's just a disaster.
Okay.
They just kept throwing more and more money into it
Right.
to save face. It became like a huge press thing.
Yeah. And usually you have maybe that one person who's like, no, this project is really going to work, right? So they might dominate. So if you think about our teams lecture and the dynamics within teams, yeah, if you have somebody who's really overpowering based on their personality or based on their role, maybe that could have been something that was happening in that decision-making process. Yeah, absolutely. No.
This might be a weird question, but is there a certain, I don't know, organization or something for people who can go into a situation like that and be like, hey, you've done all you can, just quit it? You know?
Okay. Well, and that's something we're going to be addressing kind of in what are some things that you could do to prevent escalation of commitment. And what you're talking about is kind of how do we bring in that third party perhaps, or how do we bring in someone who could evaluate the solution who was not tied to it from the
But
start?
also someone that people respect, because if someone
Sure.
comes in and says, hey, this isn't working, and
Okay.
you spend your entire life savings on this,
Mm-hmm.
you're like, well, who are you going to
Okay.
tell me that it's not
Yeah,
I
so
feel like in organizations, the function of a board, like a
Uh-huh.
board, because they don't actually have like a financial stake per se in it. But like in the case of the case study we just
Sure.
did, the board is corrupt as well. Then it's like,
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and yeah, to Daniela's point, the board is usually supposed to be holding the CEO accountable surrounding the key strategic decisions being made or implemented in the organization, right? More thoughts? Are you good?
Like what do you
Yeah.
do? What like let's say that company, like what should they do when their whole board is corrupt as well?
SNC Lavalin,
Yeah.
like for our case?
Yeah.
What are your
That's
thoughts?
what I'm
Government
talking about.
doesn't want an attack them either because they're voting liberal, which is another story.
Okay, well, think about kind of the key things, but don't talk about today's happenings with SNC Lavalin. Let's talk about what was presented in the case. Because one question that was requested of you to answer was a more an implementation-oriented question, where it's like, what do you propose be done, right? And you have a situation where, yeah, as Daniela pointed out, even the board was kind of corrupt, or even the board was overlooking some of these unethical behaviors that came about. Any thoughts? Any things that you guys proposed, Matt?
You could have like a third-party system.
Sure.
Where, like, an employee, like let's say for example, an employee has like a problem, they find like some kind of, instance of bribery or something within the company. They can report it to their supervisor, or
Sure.
if that doesn't work, then they can report it to their manager. If that doesn't work, they have a hotline to the CEO. If that doesn't work, they
Right.
should refer it.
Yeah, and those hotlines are common, like for whistleblowers, essentially,
Yeah.
right? You're thinking about things like pertaining to whistleblowers. Yes, thoughts?
Yeah, I was just saying try to, one thing they can do is try to get board of directors that care about their earnings as well as their ethical principles,
Yeah.
and also try to provide employees with relocation, retraining packages and packages that, or relocation packages, so that even if the company does downsize or shut down because of unethical behavior, they can still retain their job and will feel more prone to speak out against any unethical
Okay. Okay, good luck. And yeah, you mentioned a very good point, and that is something we talk about quite a bit where we study in corporate governance, surrounding the selection of people for your board, right? So how do you make sure that those processes are more accurate or more objective to start with? So yeah, do we care about their values and their character and what they represent, right? Because they are kind of holding the CEO, a key decision maker, in check, right? They are the people who are kind of making sure that the CEO is doing things kind of within bounds. So yeah, who is on your board? Kind of figuring out that component of who is on my board. I would argue that yes, it does influence the ethical decision making that goes on in the organization and how you treat failing decisions or bad decisions. Noah?
I have a question because this is, I feel like I'm missing something. So, for SNC Lavalin, the case study
Okay.
was published in 2017, which is last.
Yeah, arguably less severe.
But now there's still problems. So does that mean they didn't take any measures to fix what was wrong?
It's definitely a sign that things have been festering
Right.
for a while, right?
Yeah.
And that case talks about things that have been going on from even before, right? So yeah.
So basically what you're saying is that everyone knew that they were just corrupt as hell.
From what the case was telling us, is a lot of people knew,
Yeah.
right? And across the
In a
board, across
textbook,
different
which is
organizations.
purchased,
Mhm.
and nobody did anything about it, and now they're still corrupt, and it's still a problem.
Yeah.
So who fixes that? Like the government, but the government didn't do anything. I'm sorry.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely it's an astute point. But yeah, things have been festering and things were not addressed even early on, right? So I hope in your analysis of the predictors of unethical behavior at SNC Lavalin, I hope you guys coined some of the good. Actually, let's talk about this. What are some of the predictors, or what are based on the Mars model? Because that was the question you have to answer. Based on the Mars model, what are some of the things that predicted this bad decision making as it pertains to ethics? So here we're dealing with ethical decision making when it came to our case. So what are some predictors that you guys pointed out that you thought led to that? I would say, Noah, kind of, you're talking about the point of kind of like the organizational environment, perhaps, the checks in place, the consequences, assessments, right? I would say that's your argument, is that things within the structure or the systems in the organization have allowed that to pass for a while. Other stuff, Noah and then others?
Well,
Okay. Keep going.
Some of them had financial incentives, so some of them pocketed some of the money for bribes.
Okay. So as part of the Mars model, like let's use this as a review for our exam. As part of the Mars model, absolutely perfect, right? So that financial component, right? Extrinsic motivation, that motivator, what was there, right? And people who are more financially inclined, or you know more about those materialistic things. Yeah, you could argue that is a predictor there. We'll go there, and then Daniela. and then Zara.
Lack of safeguards.
Okay.
Everyone is doing it in the workplace, so.
Okay. Okay. So it seemed to be an organizational kind of norm, right? So the
They're
norms.
motivated by it.
Yeah.
Because there was no rules.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay. That's a good argument there, Daniela and then Zara.
I think with some of the non-executive employees
Okay.
perceive themselves to be pretty powerless.
Sure.
Like in the case of the employee who was working in like a remote area
Nigeria.
in Nigeria,
Yeah.
he kind of didn't really have an option. Like it was either I do what I'm told and everything is fine, I just turn a blind eye, or like I say no and I don't know what the heck's going to happen to me.
Because I'm in a remote area in Nigeria where I have
Yeah.
no access to HR or anything. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, Zara and then Diego.
Well, yeah, it definitely has something to do with role perception, but I also put it as kind of their ability, because they didn't have the ability to get projects, they resorted to bribes to kind of mask that kind of thing as a result.
Okay.
And also it tied into their values as a company, the company culture, which
Sure.
was pretty loose.
Yeah. Values is a big one. Diego and then Matt.
Yeah, just kind of backing up Daniela, like the roles were pretty set in stone by the upper management to the employees that were lower, because like they weren't really letting them think critically or anything like that. They were just
Okay.
making them work from like the neck down, basically, just because they wanted to be the middleman in order to take the bribe. And so then that affects the motivation of the
Okay.
workers, right? And even the motivation to even care about the company in the first place, to even whistle blow, because they're like, okay, I'm getting money and that's all I'm going to do.
Okay.
I'm trying to just, like, their values are in place of just self-sustaining instead of to thrive
Great.
the company.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good way to put it, and emphasizing that intersectionality of role perceptions and motivation there. Okay, Matt, and then we'll come back here.
There was a case between the senior executive who was getting convicted for bribery and stuff like that, and the company was claiming that they thought that the PCCs were like legitimate funds, and he pocketed it, but he was claiming that everybody else knew that they weren't
that situational factor component and kind of that mismatch in in the attributions there. Okay. Interesting. Okay. We'll go first. We'll go there.
I don't know if this is it, but I think it's a couple of situational factors as well. Because like, if you're going through the means of driving towards your contracts, then must be competitive industry.
Okay.
And they also are under pressure from stakeholders, shareholders.
Okay. Okay. Good points. Cool.
So, in terms of driving and stuff, the reason why it could have continued was maybe because they drive people within the government, potentially?
Okay. So they're stakeholders that they affiliated with?
Well, I mean, like, the only reason, well, other than the elections, but the only reason why we think that they would be able to continue this was because the government didn't want to do anything about it.
Okay. So that reinforced it or enabled it. Absolutely. Okay. Any other thoughts, or we're good to keep wrapping up? Should we walk towards wrapping up our lecture? Good. Okay. So we were talking about escalation of commitment and some of the reasons that come about or that predict escalation of commitment. We talked about kind of, you need to save face, especially if you're at a higher level. If you're at the top of the organization, right? You don't want to be seen as someone who's incompetent or someone who's not able to make good decisions. So that saving face component is a big aspect of it, especially if the norms within the organization or within the country that you're operating within kind of reinforce that. That is something that would come about quite a bit there, or it would manifest at quite a high level. Some things that might drive that would be kind of, again, not wanting to waste resources, right? So we've already spent $5,000 on this project. Why not just add another $1,000, right? But again, it was failing from the start. Should you even be wasting any more money on it, right? But we have that knack to think that we could salvage it by just adding more money there, okay? Some things that drive that, as we alluded to a bit earlier, it's from the start. The way we started coining that problem or identifying that problem, that's what led us here. Okay, and that is going to generate the kind of that escalation of commitment. Some people, by virtue of their personality, right, that might drive them. Depending on their personality profile, that could kind of predict this type of behavior. Or the different moods or emotions, we also see those come about. Okay. Another one that we've already alluded to also in our conversation is reducing that dissonance, right? So I committed something, I bought something, I put money into a certain project, it failed or it's failing. I want to reduce that feeling of discomfort, right? I want to make myself feel better about what I invested in, okay? So that's something that may cause me to escalate commitment. Some ways that we could actually prevent escalation of commitment or try to mitigate it as much as possible. In the earlier stages of the rational decision-making process, you want to make sure that, especially at the problem identification stage, so early on when we are first approaching our problem or tackling our problem, we want to encourage the team or the CEO or anybody who's dealing with it to start to experiment as much as possible. We want them to view all perspectives. We want them to kind of tackle it from different sides. We want them to question it quite a bit, right? We don't want a decision to just be made willy-nilly. We don't want the fastest decision, but we want to be poking holes at the problem. We want to be poking holes at the different alternatives that we're assessing, okay? So you want to make sure that your team or the person in charge of this decision-making process is really dabbling with it as much as possible early on, so you could truly frame it in a good manner, okay? So those are some of the things that we could do early on in the process. Other things that you could do to mitigate escalation of commitment is by being quite objective in setting your goals, what you hope to achieve, the standards that you perhaps hope to achieve. Okay, what are some things that I need to check off my list, essentially, and I will use that as my map or that as my guideline. Okay, so that could really hinder you from spending more money on something that is not meeting certain goals, right? And if you're doing that in a regular manner or in a continuous manner, you're likely to pick up on that a bit earlier on and not having to wait until the very end. Okay? So holding yourself in check through those metrics and criteria, checks and balances, that could be helpful. Another thing that we see, in how we kind of assess people or how we assess performance, oftentimes we only focus or fixate on the final outcomes, but we don't assess people on how they went about getting to that outcome. So you want to make sure that you're
looking at that. You're looking at the process as a whole. You're being comprehensive. You're giving credit where it's due, right? Because they may have done certain things correctly, but certain things they were at fault in doing them, right? So you want to make sure you're acknowledging the whole process, and you're not just kind of concerned with the final outcome, okay? Because if I'm only concerned with generating the most profit out of this project, I'm going to escalate commitment and do whatever it takes, even when it is irrational, just to show that I have a positive profit or figure at the very end, right? So you want to encourage the acknowledgement of the process that goes into things, or the different aspects of decision making that go into it.
So when we talk about that, are we also talking about having a transparency type of business where you're open to explaining what you're doing, you can justify it? So is that kind of what we're looking at?
I would say you definitely want transparency as kind of as a norm or as a thing that you want to be appreciated in the organization, right? So I would go with the organizational environment in that. If we're not an organization that values transparent processes, documenting what we do, right? That's cause for concern here. If you're not an organization that approves it, not approves, but upholds that, it's definitely something that would be cause for concern, I'd say. Good point. This is something that we've already touched on a bit earlier, kind of introducing that third party, or making sure that the person who's making the decision or the person who's involved in the decision-making process early on is not the same person that's evaluating it at the end, right? So having a third party or having a different person come in and evaluate it, okay, you kind of dissociate that emotional aspect, right? So somebody is less inclined to kind of commit or has less leeway to commit escalation of commitment when they're not the person or they're not the sole person assessing it at the end. Okay, so that's the benefit of adding that third perspective or that third party in there. When it comes to groups or teams of people making decisions, interestingly enough, we actually see a greater likelihood of teams committing escalation of commitment rather than the individual person, right? Here, I would say the key mechanisms or the key dynamics going into making this come to be, like there's more support, right? If one person says, oh, we could just add $1,000 more to it and the project will be salvaged, right? The team also will all agree with that and they'll push that or they'll support that, right? So you're getting that kind of cohesion coming into play there now.
Could there also be a sense of potential peer pressure within that?
Sure, yeah. So part of it could be positive, like, no, guys, we got this. Like, we're a good team. We could salvage this. But yeah, other situations might feature some peer pressure in that. Yes, the team is doing it as a project, but you also don't want to look bad as an individual. So you might pressure others in the team to kind of commit to that avenue which features escalation commitment. Absolutely. Other thoughts on why things like that happen in teams? Why we see escalation commitment happen in teams at a greater likelihood? Any other thoughts?
Like going back to your whatever it's called, sorry, but like forming.
The stages of group development, yeah?
Thank you, yes. I feel like, especially when teams are just being formed, and it happens so quickly that it's hard to actually identify who the right leader should have been.
Okay. So perhaps kind of the leadership that was that emerged was not perhaps the right person to kind of, when it came to making these types of decisions or dealing with escalation of commitment, they didn't turn out to be the right person?
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps. Okay, any other thoughts on that? Okay. So those are generally kind of some of the things that we see or that we advocate or we support when it comes to preventing escalation of commitment. Now, other things that we've always brought about in our lectures and we've always talked about their influence are emotions and moods. So again, don't discount the effect of kind of emotions in the moment, things that you're going through in the moment and how they could affect your decisions, right? And also moods, kind of things that are more permanent, that always tend to be there. Generally speaking, though, when you're in more of a positive state of mind, you're experiencing positive emotions or positive moods, okay? You're more likely to see things in a good way, right? You think that everything is going great, nothing could go wrong, so you're more likely to underestimate the risks of a certain decision or a certain solution, right? You don't weigh out the pros and cons very carefully, or you don't do your due diligence properly because you think nothing could go wrong. Things are going great today, so everything is going to go great today, right? Everything I decide on is going to go great today. So not really making sure you're pacing yourselves early on, that could impact you there. So that is something we see when it comes to the influence of positive moods and emotions. The major one being we overestimate the positive likelihood of things happening, and we underestimate the likelihood of negative things happening. Okay? When it comes to negative emotions or negative moods, again, you're more calculated. You tend to be more calculated because you're already in a negative mindset. You're more likely to emphasize the negative things that could go on. So you're more likely to take a step back and kind of assess things and really weigh out the pros and cons and dig deeper into a certain solution and into assessing it. Okay? So those are some key differences that we see there. People experiencing positive moods and emotions, they tend to kind of jump to conclusions and short-circuit the process. Again, because they are of that belief that things are going well, so nothing could potentially affect them. Okay? Questions about positive or negative moods and emotions and how they pan out? Sorry.
Well, isn't that better to always be in a negative mood when you're making a decision on that?
I mean, so what's good about it, perhaps, is that you're more conscious of the costs, right? But also sometimes, like remember our example of expenditure, $10,000 expenditure, right? You also want to make sure that you're not always negative, that you're kind of steering away from everything, okay? So I'd say that's where you want to be careful. We don't want to be enforcing everybody to be in a negative mood. Like what a terrible workplace to go into if everybody's always in a negative mood, right? Just for the sake of thinking our decisions a bit longer, no. We want to be balanced. We want to be careful in how we kind of go through the decision-making process is what we're advocating, okay? So again, always think of these things as a spectrum. We don't want one or the other, okay? We want to be balanced, okay? Don't go, as a leader, as a future, don't go enforcing your employees to be in a negative mood all the time, okay? Other questions? Okay. So, as I told you earlier on when we started the lecture, the best way to study this chapter or the best way to approach it and think about it, your blueprint is to lay out different stages of the rational decision-making process and split the comparison into perfectly rational conditions and boundedly rational conditions, okay? And do the compare and contrast, okay? Lay out the different biases, the major false biases and errors that come about under conditions of bounded rationality, okay? And understand those carefully. So I've put that table in the slide deck for you to help guide you in that sense. But I've also laid out the different biases. And we've talked about quite like the majority of those either today or in our lecture on perception or the perceptual process. So this is kind of more so a slide where you're revisiting all these biases that we talked about. So we're seeing the hindsight bias explained there again. We're seeing confirmation bias. I would say the only one that we didn't talk about and we'll talk about now is the anchoring effect. And that's one where if you kind of start with a certain estimate or a certain idea in mind about like the cost of a house, let's say, you tend to fixate around that figure and you tend to kind of base your decisions off of that, but you don't consider other values or other things or other prices that come about. So it's that fixatedness on a starting point or an estimate that you first started with, and then you just stay there, right? You stay within that realm. No.
Is it kind of like giving yourself like an immovable budget, and then
Essentially, and sometimes it's quite unrealistic because the way you informed yourself about that budget is faulty, right? So I'm in the market for a house in Toronto, I see one house advertised and the price is that, and I think that generally houses are all within that range, when there could actually be quite a wide range of prices, but I'm only fixated on that initial estimate that I came across, and that's it, right? So that influences your other decisions in relevance to that problem. Lavina.
So when it comes to, like that example you gave, you saw one house and then you assumed that was kind of what all of them are going to be like. Are we talking about goals the same way? Like,
Goals, like,
as in a certain, as a business, in a certain amount of years, I want to make this amount. Can that change? Like, I'm just trying to get the difference between seeing one thing and then assuming all of them are like that versus like goals.
Yeah, I would say, okay, so let's say you enter the organization, you're like, I want to make this salary in 5 years. Yeah, I would say it's quite different in a sense, right? In that you're aspiring for something. You're aspiring for a certain outcome in 5 years. Well, I would say, yeah, you want to make sure that you're acknowledging that times change, factors of determining the wage change. So there might be some difference there. But yeah, I would say there is some level of distinction between kind of something you're aspiring to, an aspiration point, versus I'm just fixated on this estimate because it's the only one that I saw and it's my starting point. And there's a bit of a distinction there. But yeah, like for example, if you take the salary, like or the salary that I hope to get in 5 years, yeah, it's good to have that aspiration, but also be conscious of the fact that different factors go into predicting those salaries in 5 years, and it may change. So be flexible with your points. Okay? Other thoughts? Okay, so revise those cognitive biases. We've talked about them quite a bit in our process, or the rational decision-making process today. So what we'll do now, let's break for 10 minutes. And then we'll come back to discuss exam, to discuss case analyses, and specifically kind of things like citations, kind of